Thank you so much, Colonel Turkson. And now let me introduce John Scanlon, the former UN Secretary General of CITES, the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species of Wild Fauna and Flora, and the head of End Wildlife Crime. Please, John.
Great. Thank you very much. And thank you to the co-conveners for hosting today's important event, and warm greetings to all distinguished participants and colleagues worldwide. Just a few weeks ago, I was in Assisi, which is the birthplace of St. Francis, who is the patron saint of animals and ecology. So I'm feeling particularly inspired to address you today. If we look back at this time last year, I'm sure that we all thought we'd be coming out of this COVID-19 pandemic by now. Unfortunately, that is not the case. At some stage, we will get through it, but when we do, it won't be over. In fact, far from it. While it's still too early to draw any final conclusions about the origins of COVID-19, it most likely had its origins in a wild animal. And as we've just heard, we know about the origins of previous pandemics and of the conditions that make the spillover of viruses from animals to humans more likely. Health and wildlife experts continue to warn us of the health risk associated with people mixing with wild animals, which previous speakers have just highlighted. Yet when left alone, wild animals pose no risk to human health. The risk comes from how we, as people, interact with wildlife, and that is something we can manage. And it's just not the health risk that we need to be concerned about. In addition to these risks, the UN IPBES predicts that due to our actions, over 1 million species will go extinct over the coming decades, including as a result of overexploitation and the loss of habitat. And climate change is at the top of the international agenda. And one response to help mitigate climate change is nature-based climate solutions. They can offer about a third of the carbon dioxide mitigation needed between now and 2030. Yet habitat loss and the overexploitation of wildlife degrades ecosystems and their ability to sequester carbon. We need to recalibrate our relationship with nature for many compelling interrelated reasons, including to protect biodiversity, combat climate change, and to prevent future pandemics. And this is going to require profound changes to how we regulate the taking, trade, and consumption of wildlife, how we combat wildlife crime, and how we manage and finance the protection of wildlife at its source. And today I'm going to briefly touch upon just two of these issues, namely wildlife trade and wildlife crime. The current international legal regime for regulating wildlife trade and combating wildlife crime is inadequate in setting the framework for regulating the trade, markets, and consumption that pose a risk to public health, as well as for ending wildlife crime. And the Global Initiative to End Wildlife Crime, which I'm fortunate to chair, is promoting changes to this framework, changes that will enshrine into law how states will work together to prevent future wildlife-related pandemics and to end wildlife crime, and in a manner that delivers multiple other local and global benefits. Now, our starting point is that these are challenging, global, interconnected issues. Viruses can spill over in any country, and wildlife crime is a scourge affecting every continent. And while countries can always act alone, effectively tackling these risks requires a collective response. And as such, it's preferable to agree upon and to follow a common set of rules to address the risk of pandemics emerging from wildlife trade, markets, and crime from anywhere, both now and into the future. Now, firstly, very briefly on wildlife trade. The global agreement that exists to regulate international trade in wildlife, known by its acronym CITES, takes decisions based solely upon biological and trade criteria, doesn't pay any attention to the risk that such trade could pose to human or animal health, and nor does it address domestic wildlife markets. This clearly needs to change. Regulating wildlife trade needs to be based on a One Health approach where biological, human, and animal health criteria are all taken into consideration. And states should hardwire taking a One Health approach into the international legal framework. And they can do so by either amending CITES to expand its remit to cover human and animal health in wildlife markets, or to build a One Health approach into the proposed International Pandemics Treaty. Secondly, on wildlife crime. In addition to posing a threat to human and animal health, wildlife crimes are driving many species towards extinction. They're degrading entire ecosystems and their ability to sequester carbon. They're depriving governments of up to $12 billion in revenue annually, exacerbating corruption, insecurity, and poverty. And if we look to all species being illicitly trafficked, not just the 38,000 species regulated under CITES, and include the impacts of these crimes on ecosystems, then the World Bank estimates their value at a staggering $1 to $2 trillion a year. Yet notwithstanding the destructive and high-risk nature of these crimes to both people and wildlife, there is no global agreement on tackling wildlife crime, as there is, for example, on human trafficking. And in the absence of any alternative, we have, to date, relied heavily upon CITES, which is a 50-year-old trade-related and not a crime-related convention. Enhanced global connectivity, the ability of organized crime to operate across international borders, and the trafficking of wildlife at an industrial scale requires both enhanced global cooperation and national responses to tackling wildlife crime. It is time to embed combating and preventing these crimes into the international criminal law framework. And we released a first working draft on the possible form and content of a new global agreement on wildlife crime to help advance the discussion. And this draft agreement includes an obligation on states to make it a criminal offence to import any wildlife that is acquired in contravention of the laws of the country from where it was taken. And this would represent an extraordinary expression of comity between nations or a mutual respect for one another's laws. It would also apply to any species of wild fauna or flora, including fish and timber, that is protected under any international or, importantly, any national law. And as such, it would include the millions of species that are not listed by CITES, but may be illegally harvested and traded internationally, as is frequently the case with timber and fish trafficking. Distinguished participants, the world is still feeling the full brunt of a pandemic, which most likely had its origins in a wild animal. And we're advised that there are hundreds of thousands of new viruses that could spill over from wildlife to humans. We're struggling to combat climate change and staring down the loss of 1 million species. Given the scale of the risk to people and the planet, we must ratchet up both our national and global responses to these threats. And if we get it right, the local communities living amongst wildlife, legitimate investors, and the governments of source countries, as well as our global biodiversity, climate, health, and security, will all be beneficiaries. Finally, I'm delighted to inform you that in May of this year, the president of Gabon, Ali Bongo Ondimba, and the president of Costa Rica, Carlos Alvarado Quesada, presidents of two biodiverse rich countries, jointly called for a new global agreement on wildlife crime. And I'd like to finish my presentation today by sharing a short video with you that captures why they did so. Thank you for the invitation to join you today, and I hope you enjoy the video.
Thank you, John Scanlon, for that excellent presentation and that really interesting video, and for making those two very clear recommendations. And it looks like at least one of them is getting traction with a couple of very important heads of state.